For this tutorial, we're going to be using the studio version of a song called Jericho, written by my friend Joey Summers. And it sounds like this. It doesn't sound like that. It sounds like this. So let the walls cave in, break my Jericho. I know you came to win, captive in my soul. I was lost in sin when I was in control. Then your son stepped in, oh the glory of it all. So let the walls cave in, break my Jericho. Cool. So that's going to be in the outro of the song, where all the elements are in, so all the instruments are in, and the mix is really moving. So what I want to do first is I want to break down mixing, bass, and drums. So let's start by listening to just the bass and drums. And there's going to be one staccato string also playing, because that took the role of the low end in the outro. So let's have a listen there. I'm going to disable or make inactive all my music and all my vocals at this point. So I'm going to make them inactive so we don't have to worry about any automation turning them back on, because I have a bunch of mute automation happening. So let's make them inactive. So by right-clicking, these are my two subgroups, and we're going to get into subgroups a little later. But all of my vocals were coming in to this channel. All of the music was coming into this channel, which they're both stereo aux channels, okay? So let's listen to that same portion of the song with just the drums and the bass. Okay, bass and drums. So in a lot of places, and in the way I like to think about the bass and the drums, they are my foundational elements. There's a book that we're going to be reading that hopefully you have. It's the Mixing Engineer's Handbook. This fellow named Bobby Ozinski wrote it. It's super helpful. I think I mixed my first couple of records with that book on my lap. So go through that. You're going to see a section of that book, and it's going to be mixing bass and drums, or mixing drums, mixing bass. That's going to prove helpful. So I like to think of the drums as foundational. The bass is foundational. It's those sounds and that element that you kind of bop your head along to, and you find the groove. That's bass and drums. And if you can get the bass and drums in a really good spot, then you're going to set yourself up for, I think, a really dynamic and a really good mix, a solid mix that hopefully folks will like to listen to. So let's come in and let's just look at the drums, and we're going to kind of look at this a little bit backwards. I'm going to go over to my I'm going to go to my mixing window by hitting Command equals, and then I'm going to look at the mixing window here. So this is the mixing window. This is an editing window. Okay, those are the two most popular windows in Pro Tools. So let's take a look. Let's find the drums. Usually I color my drums green because in my head drums are green. And starting over here with the cowbell, which I think is played once. There's one cowbell hit in this entire song. I'd love for you to find that. And coming back over here to the kick top. So these are our drums for the track. And then I'm gonna come over here and I'm gonna grab these three things, and I'm gonna pull them over so we can see them. Okay, let me add that cymbal in there as well. So we have from the kick top, we have 3 kicks. We have a kick return. We'll talk about returns in a second. We have 2 snares. We have a regular snare, and then we have a snare explode. Okay, so we'll take a listen to that. We have 3 toms. We have hats. We have ride. We have 1 overhead in mono. We have 1 room in mono. And then we have 1 cowbell. I also have some cymbals happening. So we'll take a look at this and some cymbal prints, so some samples of cymbals in stereo that I've scattered throughout this track. Now, the first thing I want to mention is that the drums on this particular recorded using a virtual instrument, okay? So our drums were recorded using Stephen Slate SSD. the sampler, which is this. It looks like this. This is what we use to record drums on this particular song. Do I always use virtual instruments for drums? No, but for this song, that's what we have. So I'll get into that another time. So let's have a listen to just the drums in this same portion. See if we can get a tom in here somewhere. Coming up here. Cool. So let's start with the kick drum. What does the kick drum sound like? We have 3. So I'm going to solo. I'm going to take all the solos off of this. So I have a kick top and I have a kick sub. And in this portion of the song, there's no kick sample. So let's take a listen to this kick top. There's not a lot of low end in that. Okay, we're going to get our low end from this kick sub. So let's take a look of what type of plugins that I've used to get that sound. Okay, so the first thing, one of the biggest things, is this EQ, and it's a high pass. So I've high passed up to 426 hertz. The next biggest EQ or plugin on this track is actually the one down here a little ways called Trigger 2. Trigger 2 is going to be the sound of this kick, and it wouldn't even really make sense to listen to this kick before we put that Trigger 2 plugin on. So we have a high pass, we have an EQ, we have some distortion with a decapitator, but really what we have is this trigger. So let's play just this whole kick drum with all these plugins on, and I'll bypass this Trigger 2 sampler. Hear the difference there? Let's back on. Okay, so really, sometimes in mixing, I'll get started with the sound, and then I'll get halfway through the sound and realize it's not really the sound that I want. So in this case, I grabbed a sample from Stephen Slate's Trigger, and I reshaped the sound. Should I have gone and turned off those plugins beforehand? Yeah, maybe, but I didn't. So let's take a look really at this sample after the Trigger 2. That's when this sample really starts and the sound really starts taking shape. So I have Trigger 2 on, and then let's take a look of what's next. So I have this 1176. I like the black one for instruments. I like the black one on vocals a lot too. We'll get into that a little bit later. Typically, I do use the silver one or the blue one for vocals, but I find the black one just a little bit more transparent, okay? So this is a compressor. So what I'm doing on the kick is I'm just leveling out these samples a little bit. They're already leveled. They're samples. So I'm using this for probably a little bit of gain and a little bit of control over that sample and the shape of that sample. So how long do I want the sample? How long do I want the tail to be before it gets choked off? Things like that. That's what I'm using this compressor for. So let's listen to it before the compressor and after the compressor, same spot. Take it off. So it just kind of just brings it out front just a little bit. It's not doing too much actually. The next thing that we've got up here is an SSL EQ. So here I'm dipping a little bit of the high end at 8K. I'm dipping a little bit of 4.5K. So let's take a listen to that. This is with it on and bypassed. So we're just darkening it up just a little bit, okay? And finally, we have an EQ, and this is automated. So we're not really going to get into the automation of this just yet. Earlier on in the song, I've actually automated out a lot of the high end. And then at the end of the song, when it gets to this really big part, I brought all the high end back in, okay? So that's anytime you see a little green dot on a fader, that means there's some automation happening. So that is our kick top. Let's go over to our kick sub now. So the kick sub kind of be the same idea except the opposite. We really want the low end here to come in. So there we get a nice low end. And here I just started with the trigger. So that same triggering software, I've just started with it. And what I have is the sub, is the kick coming through. And let's take a look. So I have, after that trigger on its own, check out what it sounded like on its own. And one of my favorite tricks is coming up. So on its own, it would sound like this. You still have the slap of the high end. You'll see that disappear in a moment. And then we have a little bit of compression. So again, a different iteration of the same type of 1176 compressor. And this one's getting smacked with a whole lot of gain reduction. Pretty quick release. A pretty quick attack too, so we're hitting it pretty quick and dulling it out a little bit. This filter freak is really going to do a lot of work. This is one of my favorite things to do. So I'm just taking a frequency beneath 20 hertz and I'm mixing it in like just a little bit. So there's one like 3 notches mixed in, but that's where you get this sub information. So this, every time the kick hits now, we're getting this little whoosh kind of information. Now you can actually calculate this. If you get, I think you can find a frequency spectrum chart, so you can find the key of the song. In our case, this song is in the key of D. So you could find, hey, the sub information of a key of D or a harmonic of D is here on this particular frequency. So you can really dial that in. This one I dialed in by ear. So this is with it on, you get this sub, and I'll take it out. Same part with it out. That's pretty cool. With it back in. This EQ is cutting a little bit of that smack. Before. Because remember, this is our sub. And finally, I have this Pultec EQ on here. And the Pultec is attenuating even more of that high end. So I have a little bit of a boost at 3K, and then I have a huge cut at 20K. Cool, so that's what that's doing. So together we have this. Okay, and then these 2 kick drums are coming over here to this return channel. So anytime I have a return channel, I capitalize the letters. It tells me right off the bat when I see something capitalized, like here I have a kick return is capitalized. Over here I have drum return is capitalized. It tells me that it's a return channel, which means something is being sent there. So I have kick return, and what I have on kick return is this fancy smancy plugin called Torque, and I've tuned this to a D. So all this is going to do, what this plugin does, is it kind of further refines the tone of your drums, which is super helpful. So now I have a kick drum that has these short bursts in the key of D. And you can do this I do it for kicks, for snares, for toms. I'll use Torque, and it really kind of helps with the overall tone of the track. So here's that same kick drum, and this is with the Torque on, and I'll take it off. Off. Back on. So that's pretty neat. You just get these short bursts of really kind of finely tuned low energy for that kick drum. All right, so let's move on to snare drum. We have 2 snare drums. So let's take a listen to just this one first. Snare top. And again, I'm just going to start with the trigger. So this is with trigger. Okay, so that's... I didn't like the original sound, but I liked the trigger sound, so I grabbed that. On this EQ, I have a little bit of a low boost at 230. I have a high cut up to 126, a little more cutting out the lows at 114, and then I have a boost, just like a dB at right around 6K on a shelf. So with, without. So it really took a lot of the kind of low mud, and it took that out of the snare drum. And it makes room for different, like for really, we're going to try to make room for our bass track. And we want our bass to be able to sing in that frequency range of like 80 to like 400 hertz. Because I want to be able to hear the bass. Typically duck some of those frequencies to make room for the bass. All right, so the last thing we have on this snare drum is, again, a focus, but this time a little bit higher at 296 hertz. And again, we're getting bursts of the key of D, so on a drum, which is pretty neat. So this is in and out. So you really hear the snare drum gets quite a bit more body, which is really, really neat. So if you listen again, I'll start with it off, and then I'll bring it in. Listen to how thin it sounds in comparison to when I take it out of bypass and I put this plug-in back on, and we get those short bursts of energy at 296 hertz, which happens to be a D. So here's without it. And here's with it. That's great stuff. Cool. Here is we're going to move on to the Snare Explode. And Snare Explode really is just doing what it says. It's doing explosion stuff, I believe. So let's have a listen to Snare Explode by itself. So it's really this CLA drum. So if we take this out, and we put it back in, that's really the sound of this snare drum. Like I have a little altar boy with probably some pitch shifting, and we'll take a look at the EQ in a second. On here, we've got a gate, we've got a reverb, and we've got a lot of compression, and I'm taking out the bass and treble because it's going to be on our snare top channel. But we're hitting it really hard with compression. We're putting it in a big hall, and then we're gating it, a hard gate. So it's like the hall is there, and then it's gone. And it's very effecty. So it's like, oh my goodness, that snare sounds huge. And then the snare disappears. It gets choked off. So that is this particular plugin. And for stuff like this, the CLA plugin is great. So this is with it as a reminder. Like, listen to that first one. Bow, and without it, it sounds like this. Right. Not very interesting. And then little altar boy, I've just shifted the format 3 cents. So it's still on the note, but it's like a 3 cents of the tone is lower, okay? I haven't changed the pitch, I've changed the format. So it's just like the sound of the snare. It's the same pitch, but it's a little bit lower. That's the best way I could maybe explain that. Another way to explain format would be like the chipmunks, when you get that really, really high, squeaky kind of chipmunk singing or whatever. It's the same pitch, but it's up really, really high. So the tone of it is really high. And the same thing with like a Darth Vader. So maybe we'll take a look at that during the vocals, and that'll make a bit more sense. Okay, so this is with this and without. So you hear it's much higher pitched without, and when I turn it on, I should say the tone is much higher, right? Because the pitch is the same. Cool. All right, and then we've got an EQ, and the EQ is just a high pass and a little bit of shelf and a little bit of like 2K. So it just gets a little bit thinner. Okay, and so the two snares together sound like this. So they really are working together. So one is doing that explosion sound, but not getting in the way of all the energy of the snare top. Okay. We have toms. I have to find the toms because they only happen just like for a moment here. So here's some tom hits, and they all kind of, well, this one hits, then that one hits. Let's listen to these two. Typical toms. You could use torque on these, and you could bring that tone out a little bit more. It looks like I have not. So on these toms, I just have a high pass at 60 hertz. Typically on toms, I find anything below 60 hertz, unless you have a big old fat tom, just kind of gets in the way, and it starts sounding weird. So I usually shelf about 60 hertz. Unless I have a really low tune tom and I want to grab some notes from, or some fundamental notes. You wouldn't really hear them, but you'd feel them. EQ wise, I'm boosting 8K and I'm boosting 3K, or 3.5K. So I'm really looking for a smacky smack kind of sound. Looks like I even put the filter in on this, so I'm filtering out lows again. Is that necessary? Probably not. But I think I do it more by habit. I just, filter button, and I filter. So let's take a listen to just this tom right here, the tom 2. And before EQ. So it's a little duller, and now it's a bit more exciting. All right, and let's take a listen to tom 3, which in my head would be lower, because tom 1 would be the highest, tom 2 and tom 3. For me, it goes left to right. So boom, boom, boom. Let's see if I'm right. Yes. Okay, so let's have a listen before, and then what do we do? Let's take off all the... So that to me sounded like a virtual, like a virtual drum kit. It sounded fake. So you see me, I added a trigger. So let's just take a look at this trigger. And I mixed it at 100%, so I didn't like that. Yeah, so that's huge. So I didn't like the sound of that tom that we picked with that SSD sampler. It sounded like this. Okay. I didn't like that. So I turned it into this. To me, that sounds like a tom. Like, that sounds more like a tom. That sounds like a real tom, a dude or dudette in the room hitting a tom. So I like that. I could hear the notes. That was cool. Looks like I stuck a gate on here. So let's have a listen to the gate on. And that's just cutting down on that ring. So listen to a no gate and listen to the ring at the end. So, which is a very natural way for a drum to end. I just wanted to get it out of there. This is such a busy arrangement. I needed to make room for all the other instruments. So tom disappeared. So this is with the gate. So it got quieter much quicker. That's what a gate does. A gate basically, it opens after the signal. So represented by this red line, it opens after this signal reaches a certain threshold, okay, which is above this knob right here, this virtual knob. And then the gate closes once this threshold goes beneath. Okay, and I'm closing the gate by infinity. So the sound will disappear. You don't have to close it by infinity. You could close it by like 2 dB, by 4 dB, by 6 dB, and that would be much more natural. If you want the sound to go away, you close it by infinity. Infinity is closed. So that's what that sounds like. And then finally, I'm hitting this EQ. And on this EQ, I'm making it smack a bit more. So I'm adding like 4 dB at 8K, and I'm adding a good 2.5 dB almost at like 3.5K. So, and the filter's back on. So I'm in a habit of filtering stuff when I need to filter it. So it sounds like this with the EQ. So, but a little bit more smacky. A little less, kind of, but more dull. And here it is again, smacky. Now notice I don't take any time explaining these two plugins up here because I put the trigger on after. Is that a bad habit? Probably, but that's just my workflow. Like, hey, I tried to shape this drum. I still don't like this drum. Let me move on and replace it with trigger. If I don't like the trigger, I'll just make it inactive so I can control command click, and then I still have my original plugin so I can continue. So that's probably why I've gotten into this habit of just leaving, even though they're not doing anything at this point, because I've taken this sound that was being worked on up to here and I've replaced it. So in Pro Tools, all these plugins that go from top to bottom. So I've replaced the sound as I get to here, which totally makes these things rather useless because I took 100% of this sample and basically I'm starting again from scratch at that point. So I can put these back in, but they're not going to make a difference. Okay, we have hats. And here on these hi-hats, I've trimmed them up, so I've just turned the gain up, which is a really handy thing to have in Pro Tools. And then I've just taken everything beneath 200 hertz. I've just taken it out of that track. So we heard the hats for like 2.5 seconds there. And then we have a ride. I don't know if it's in this spot. It's not. But these crashes are. Oh, that was our cowbell. Wow, we hit a cowbell. So on the overheads, I'm just doing a high pass filter, 300 hertz. I want to come back and kind of hit these rooms and stuff. And notice how between the overheads, what's nice about the SSD is I can say, hey, I can grab the cymbal mics. And then I could grab the room mics. And I could put which instruments I want. So of the drum kit. And I could say, okay, in the overheads, I want to hear the whole kit. Or I just want to hear the cymbals. Just give me like a cymbal type of mic. So that's what's going on here. I can't hear the snare, even though the snare's hitting. In typical drums, a drum setup, when you're miking an acoustic kit, in the overheads, you're going to hear the snare, the kick, the toms. You're going to hear everything. What's nice about doing it virtually is I can say, just give me the cymbals. And then later, I actually have stereo cymbals that I've printed. So it's really just the cymbals and that cowbell, which apparently happens more than once. So here's the rooms. Now that's the whole kit. So I hear the snare. Everything sounds like it's just a little bit more distant. And EQ-wise, I just have a roll off to 300 hertz. So that's the room mics. So that's causing some. That's nice. That causes the drum kit to make it sound like it was recorded in a room. So even though it's virtual, that's what's happening there. Let's take a listen again. So we have all these drums happening, and we have a cymbal print. Let's see if that's happening here. So I have 4 stereo cymbal tracks right now, and they're all feeding this cymbal return. So it's capitalized. I know it's a return. So let's take a listen to just some more crash cymbals that I have. Okay, so it's like a rise and a hit. And let's take a listen to that with the rest of the drums, and that'll be the end of the drums. So let's grab all of this, and we have these. So you hear it. So this is out, cymbal return, and listen to the energy it brings once we bring in these. Cool. Want to take a listen. So those are the sounds for the drums. So the real thing is, the question is, once you have your drums, how do you even start getting the faders up? How do you even pick levels for the drums? I start typically with the kick. I do kick, snare, and then I'll come over to the room and I'll start bringing in the room mic. What's too much? What's too little? What's the vibe of the song? Because there's a lot of vibe in those room mics. So I'll get my kick and snare sounding good, a good balance after you get the kick and snare and maybe the room mic sounding good. I don't want my toms usually to be super loud. But after this, I'll go over to the bass, and I'll bring in the bass, and I'll start listening to volume between the kick and the bass. I'm like, yeah, I kind of want them to be the same. So that's what we're going to do next. We're going to go over to the bass guitar and have a listen to what it's doing in relationship to the kick. Okay. So if I come over here, these are all like auxiliary drums that we're looking at here. We're not going to get into these, but these are all more drums that are doing just little tiny things. But I don't want to. I want to go to the bass now. So the bass and the drums are going to work together. So let's just take a listen to the bass. And we want to listen from perhaps like the outro. Listen from the outro to the end, because there's going to be some bass playing here. And let's kind of pinpoint this a little bit. So there's our bass. Let's get rid of all of these drums, and let's just bring in the kick and the snare. Or let's just bring in the kick to start and the bass. And I'll bring in those two as well. Okay. So I can hear the kick happening each time. I'm not losing the kick. What can often happen is, man, that bass comes in and it kind of muddies up the kick, and the kick kind of disappears. And you're like, I don't really hear the kick drum anymore. Because the bass and the kick, they share a lot of the same frequencies. So what I've done here is I've set up a side chain compressor. So what that means is every time the kick hits, the bass is going to get ducked. So a lot of folks call this ducking. Makes sense. Let's have a listen to see how this is working in real time. So if I notice I open up this compressor right here, let's just take a listen to this bass synth and the kick. And notice this is going to be triggered. You're going to see compression happening every time you hear the kick drum. So it's in time. Things are a little bit latent because of my playback engine. But every time that kick drum hits, we're getting some compression happening on the bass, which means the bass is getting turned down. So compression really just takes a signal, and if your signal is like this, and if you compress it, then your signal can be like this, depending on what you use, how much compression you use. So I am triggering this compression from the kick drum, which kind of gives us that pulse and that pulse sound. It's like super popular in like EDM music, but it's used all over the place. So in this bass synth is brought to you. We created this part in Melodyne. Don't want to get into that too much, but like we can listen to it before Melodyne. And now after. And then I have a limiter, and the limiter is just compressing it a little bit more. Just a little bit. And this is the top end of the bass. So over here, so I've taken out all the low end on that bass synth. If I take this out, you're probably going to get a lot of low end back. Yeah. Which on its own sounds better. But I want this bass track, this acoustic bass track, I want this to be where the low end is. Again, we have this sidechain compressor that's being triggered from the kick. So every time the kick hits, this bass gets out of the way a little bit, then it comes back. And then I have boosting the mids because I really want to hear the notes on this. And it was a little fat, this bass, so I've ducked a little bit of low end. So have a listen to this. That's it's without, and so it just gets a little bit more, you hear the notes just a little bit better, and we're ducking a little bit of that low end. The decapitator, so we're driving this bass. Take a listen to it with it on and without. So this is doing heavy lifting. And back off. Hear how like dull and warm the bass gets, which in certain songs is just perfect. But in this case, we want to fight to hear the bass a little bit, so we need to drive those mids, and so that's what the decapitator is doing. So it's providing a little bit of distortion. And then we have a trusty buddy, our bass, and our bass from 80 hertz up is actually taking harmonics and kind of boosting them. So the bass gets a little dull maybe, and this R bass is actually trying to hype up the frequencies anything over 80 hertz. So it's going to be some low end in here and even up to the mids. That makes quite a difference. A C4 is a multi-band compressor. And this is doing some lifting up here. So we're cutting a little bit more low end out, and then we're boosting some low mids to really try to hear those notes. And finally, we have Spectre. And Spectre is kind of, it's doubling up what that decapitator's already doing. Why am I using it? Because I was obviously struggling to hear these notes, and I wanted to hear the notes. So before and after. Again, so without, with. So it just kind of like helps those notes pop out just a little bit. And the two basses together. And let's bring back in the drums here. So we're going to bring back in all these drums and have a listen. So all of those bass and drums, and this is the final thing we'll talk about, bass and drums, they all come back here to this stereo return. And so this stereo return is going to feed our stereo bus. And on this stereo return, I've got an EQ, and this is a great little move. So we're actually taking a lot of the mids out because we're making way for vocals and things like that. So I've got like a duck here at -6 dB. That's crazy, but it is what it is. On the sides, I'm taking out a lot of low end on the side information. So the way mid-side EQ works, instead of thinking of it as left-right of our speakers, we're going to think of it as like, hey, what's in the middle portion of the song, and hey, what's on the sides? So on the sides, I don't want a lot of low end because it kind of mucks things up a little bit. So I've taken the low end out, and I've kind of focused it in the middle channel. So I don't have I'd have a little bit of a cut. I have like a dB cut at 97 hertz. I have a little bit of a cut, 3.5 dB at 420. And then on the mid channel, I have a big cut at 2K to make room for things like guitars and vocals and things like that. That's in the middle, but I have all the power still in the middle. And on the sides, I'm ducking out a lot of that low end all the way up to 167 hertz, and I'm ducking out the sides, the mid information again. So let's have a listen to that off and on. So here's with it on. So all of these things that you're hearing are all coming through right here. So you hear it really come back to life there. And we're trying to duck that because we're going to make room for the vocals. The next thing I'm hitting is this Studer tape machine. So let's have with it on. And off. So this is like emulating it running through tape. Typically, like, I'm not afraid to hit the needle into the red is actually great every time you hear the kick. There is one more instrument I'm not playing through here, but that's okay if you drive your input So it's hitting the red. So let's even take a listen to what that sounds like. It starts to break up a little bit. And then you can adjust your output accordingly. The next thing up is Spectre. So Spectre is this distortion again emulator. It's like I'm emulating more tape. So here it is. And it's just providing a little bump in the low end and a little shine up top. Now my levels for this are probably going to be jacked up because I just changed the Studer tape machine. This one I would just want to kiss a little bit. So here's a Fairchild compressor. And I'm going to open up this. Yeah, it looks closer to the truth. And on this, I'm just having the threshold, so it just kind of kisses this one a little bit, so we get like a dB or two of gain reduction. That's about all I want. And then I've actually slowed down the release time. The way that this Fairchild compressor works is from a 1 to 6, 1 being the quickest release, 2 being a little bit slower, and so on. What's nice about this is there is a mix, so you can mix this in parallel. I have this set to 100% wet, so it's hitting this in its entirety.